The autumn of 1940 found Adolf Hitler confronting a problem that military force alone could not solve. German armies had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with speed that had stunned the world. The Wehrmacht stood triumphant across Western Europe, its tactical brilliance and operational skill seemingly unstoppable. Yet Britain, isolated and apparently vulnerable, refused to seek terms. The island nation that should have recognized the futility of continued resistance instead prepared for invasion and showed no sign of the morale collapse that Hitler had anticipated would force Churchill's government to negotiate. The Führer had assumed that strategic bombing, threat of invasion, and isolation from allies would break British will to resist. He would learn through bitter experience that morale could not be destroyed through terror when a population believed their cause worth defending. The initial German strategy for forcing British capitulation had focused on air superiority as prerequisite to invasion. The Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force, would achieve control of British skies, would create conditions where German invasion forces could cross the Channel without prohibitive losses. Yet even this military approach contained psychological assumptions. British pilots would break under sustained pressure. British civilians would panic when German bombers appeared overhead. British leadership would recognize that resistance was futile and would seek accommodation. The assumptions proved systematically wrong. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that air attacks would shatter British resistance within weeks. The bombers and fighters based in occupied France would overwhelm British defenses through sheer numbers, would destroy RAF fighter capability on the ground and in the air, would demonstrate German dominance in ways that would force British recognition of inevitable defeat. Göring's confidence reflected both his faith in Luftwaffe capabilities and his fundamental misunderstanding of what sustained British morale. The Reichsmarshal believed that showing British civilians the power of German arms would create pressure on Churchill's government to seek peace. Instead, it unified the British population behind continued resistance. The Battle of Britain that unfolded through summer and autumn 1940 tested both military capabilities and national will. The Luftwaffe launched waves of attacks against RAF airfields, seeking to destroy British fighter strength and to achieve the air superiority that invasion required. The attacks inflicted serious damage, destroyed aircraft on the ground, killed pilots who could not be quickly replaced, strained British defensive capabilities to breaking point. Yet RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, continued to function, continued to contest German air superiority, continued to exact losses that the Luftwaffe could not sustain indefinitely. The decision in early September to shift Luftwaffe attacks from military targets to London and other cities reflected German frustration that British fighter capability had not been destroyed, and reflected Hitler's belief that terror bombing would break civilian morale where attacks on military targets had not forced capitulation. The shift gave RAF fighter bases respite to repair and reorganize, but it also subjected British civilians to bombing on a scale not previously experienced. The Blitz, as it became known, tested whether British society would crack under sustained aerial assault or would endure despite casualties and destruction. The first major raids on London in September killed hundreds of civilians, destroyed homes and businesses, created fires that lit the night sky. German intelligence officers anticipated that these attacks would create panic, that civilians would demand their government seek peace, that British morale would collapse under the reality of modern warfare's destructive power. Instead, the raids strengthened resolve. Londoners who survived the bombing emerged from shelters to find their neighborhoods damaged, but their determination to resist undiminished. The casualties were mourned, the destruction was surveyed, and life continued with defiance that German planning had not anticipated. The underground stations that served as improvised bomb shelters became symbols of British resilience that German psychological warfare had not accounted for. Families huddled on platforms while bombs fell above, emerging in the morning to go to work if their workplaces still stood, to clear rubble if their homes had been destroyed, to maintain routines that demonstrated that normal life would continue despite German efforts to disrupt it. The scenes photographed in the shelters and distributed through British media showed civilians who were frightened but not broken, who endured hardship without demanding capitulation. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth's decision to remain in London throughout the Blitz, to visit bombed neighbourhoods, to share the dangers that ordinary Londoners faced, provided visible leadership that reinforced morale in ways that German intelligence had not predicted. The royal family could have moved to safety in the countryside or to Canada, as some government officials suggested. Their choice to stay, to be seen in damaged streets, to demonstrate that even the monarchy would not flee German bombing, created symbolic unity between leadership and population that made demands for surrender politically impossible. Winston Churchill's rhetoric during the Blitz articulated defiance that shaped how British civilians understood their situation. The Prime Minister's speeches framed the bombing not as a reason to seek peace, but as evidence of German barbarism that justified continued resistance. Churchill characterized endurance under bombing as heroic participation in Britain's defense, transformed civilian suffering into contribution to the war effort, gave meaning to losses that made them bearable. The speeches resonated because they reflected sentiment that already existed rather than creating it through manipulation, but they channeled and amplified morale that German strategy assumed would collapse. The production workers who maintained factory output despite bombing demonstrated that British economic resistance would not be broken through terror. The factories that produced Spitfires and Hurricanes, that manufactured ammunition and weapons, that built ships and vehicles, continued operating even when damaged by raids. Workers showed up for shifts after spending nights in shelters. Production lines adapted to work around damaged buildings. Output declined less than German planning had anticipated. The determination to maintain war production despite bombing showed that British civilians understood that their work directly contributed to defense, and that this understanding sustained morale in ways that terror could not overcome. The civil defense organizations, air raid wardens, rescue workers, firefighters, medical personnel that responded to bombing created networks of mutual support that strengthened rather than weakened social cohesion. The volunteers who dug survivors from rubble, who fought fires that threatened to spread across neighborhoods, who treated casualties and maintained essential services, demonstrated that British society could organize to meet the challenges that bombing created. The effectiveness of civil defense showed civilians that they were not helpless victims of German attacks, but were active participants in limiting damage and maintaining function. The air raid precautions, ARP wardens, who patrolled streets during raids, who enforced blackout regulations, who helped civilians reach shelters, who coordinated rescue efforts, provided visible evidence that government and community were responding effectively to the crisis. The wardens were often criticized during peacetime for being overzealous about blackout enforcement, but during the Blitz, they became essential parts of the civil defense system. Their presence in neighborhoods during raids provided reassurance that help was available, that injured civilians would be found and treated, that fires would be fought, that order would be maintained even under bombing. The Women's Voluntary Service, WW2, which mobilized thousands of women to support civil defense efforts, demonstrated that the entire population could contribute to resistance regardless of whether they wore military uniforms. WVS volunteers staffed rest centers for people whose homes had been destroyed, organized feeding programs for rescue workers, and bombed out families, collected and distributed clothing and supplies, provided countless services that maintained social welfare despite the disruption that bombing created. The organization gave women active roles in Britain's defense and created social networks that reinforced community cohesion. The heavy rescue squads that specialized in extracting survivors from collapsed buildings developed techniques and equipment through experience that made them increasingly effective as the Blitz continued. The squad's success in rescuing people who had been buried for days under rubble created stories of survival that bolstered morale and demonstrated that death was not inevitable even when buildings collapsed. The rescues provided hope that sustained families waiting for news of missing relatives and validated the effort that civil defense workers invested in searching through ruins for survivors. The emergency medical services that treated casualties from bombing expanded rapidly to meet demands that peacetime hospital capacity could not have handled. The services established first aid posts in bombed neighborhoods, trained volunteers in basic trauma care, developed systems for transporting casualties to hospitals, coordinated care across facilities that were themselves sometimes damaged by raids. The medical response's effectiveness in treating casualties and saving lives demonstrated that British society could adapt to the challenges that modern warfare created and could maintain essential services despite German attempts to disrupt them. The rest centers and communal feeding programs that provided for civilians whose homes had been destroyed showed that the welfare state could function even under bombing. People who had lost everything found shelter, food, and basic necessities provided through government and volunteer organizations. The programs prevented homelessness and hunger from compounding the trauma of being bombed and demonstrated that British society would not abandon those who had suffered losses. The support reinforced the sense that enduring bombing was a shared sacrifice rather than an individual burden. The Ministry of Information's management of news about the bombing walked a careful line between acknowledging casualties and maintaining morale. The reports honestly described damage and deaths, but emphasized recovery and resilience, showed destroyed buildings alongside functioning neighborhoods, documented losses while highlighting determination to continue. The approach avoided the propaganda excesses that might have undermined credibility while framing the bombing in ways that reinforced rather than weakened will to resist. German intelligence, accustomed to populations whose morale collapsed under bombing, failed to recognize how effectively British information management was sustaining civilian resolve. The BBC's radio broadcasts during the Blitz provided information that citizens trusted because it acknowledged difficulties while emphasizing progress in meeting challenges. The 9 o'clock news reported bombing damage honestly, gave casualty figures that were accurate if incomplete, described disruption to transportation and services that listeners could verify from their own experience. The honesty created credibility that made positive framing more effective than propaganda that denied or minimized problems would have been. When the BBC reported that Londoners were enduring bombing with fortitude, listeners believed it because the report matched their observation of how neighbors were actually behaving. The newspaper photographs and newsreel footage from bombed cities were carefully selected to show destruction alongside resilience, to document losses while emphasizing recovery, to present bombing as a challenge being met rather than as a disaster creating collapse. The images of rescue workers pulling survivors from rubble, of shopkeepers sweeping up glass and reopening for business, of families salvaging possessions from damaged homes, all told stories of perseverance that reinforced morale. German intelligence analysts viewing the same images often missed their psychological impact because they focused on physical destruction rather than on the human response being depicted. The censorship regime that controlled what information reached the public operated to prevent inadvertent help to German targeting while allowing enough candid reporting to maintain credibility. Details about specific facilities damaged or about casualties in particular raids were suppressed to prevent the Luftwaffe from assessing bombing accuracy. Information about civilian resilience and about recovery from raids was allowed and encouraged. The selective censorship meant that public information emphasized aspects of the bombing campaign that sustained morale while suppressing details that might have undermined it. The entertainment media that continued operating throughout the Blitz provided distraction and normality that helped civilians cope with the stress of living under bombing. Theaters and cinemas remained open when possible, offering shows and films that took audiences' minds off the war for a few hours. The BBC radio programs included comedy and music alongside news, providing relief from the tension of waiting for raids. The continuation of entertainment demonstrated that life would go on despite German bombing and gave civilians respite from constant focus on the war. The Home Intelligence reports that the Ministry of Information compiled from mass observation data and other sources provided government with detailed information about civilian morale that allowed responsive adjustments to information policy. The reports identified concerns that needed to be addressed, rumors that needed to be countered, successes that should be publicized. The intelligence allowed government to manage morale proactively rather than reactively, to address problems before they became serious, to reinforce positive trends. German intelligence had no comparable system for understanding British civilian psychology and therefore operated based on assumptions rather than data. The failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority meant that invasion could not proceed, but German bombing continued through autumn and winter in hopes that sustained attacks would eventually break British morale, even if they had not done so immediately. The raids shifted to night bombing as daylight attacks proved too costly, targeted cities across Britain to spread fear beyond London, employed incendiary bombs designed to create firestorms that would maximize civilian casualties and destruction. Each escalation reflected German belief that enough terror would eventually force capitulation, and each escalation demonstrated that this belief was wrong. The Coventry raid in November, which killed over 500 civilians and destroyed much of the city centre, was intended to demonstrate what would happen to British cities if resistance continued. German propaganda highlighted the destruction, broadcast descriptions of the devastation, suggested that every British city would suffer similar fate if Churchill's government did not seek terms. The British response confounded German expectations. Coventry became a symbol of endurance rather than a warning that forced submission. The rebuilding began immediately, and the raid strengthened rather than weakened determination to continue fighting. The selection of Coventry as a target reflected German calculation that destroying a historic city would create disproportionate psychological impact beyond the military value of eliminating war production facilities. The medieval cathedral that burned during the raid, the historic city centre that was reduced to rubble, the civilian population that suffered mass casualties, all were intended to demonstrate that no British city was safe, that cultural heritage would not be spared, that continued resistance would result in the destruction of Britain's architectural and historical legacy. Yet the ruins of Coventry Cathedral became a symbol of what Britain was fighting against, rather than a reason to stop fighting. The firestorm technique that German bombers attempted to create in British cities represented escalation designed to maximize civilian casualties and create terror that conventional bombing had not produced. The combination of high-explosive bombs to damage buildings and incendiary bombs to start fires was intended to overwhelm firefighting capabilities and create conflagrations that would consume entire neighborhoods. The technique worked in some raids, creating devastation that killed hundreds and left thousands homeless. Yet even the most destructive raids did not create the panic and demands for peace that German strategy required. The Plymouth raids in the spring of 1941 demonstrated the limits of what bombing could achieve against determined population. Plymouth suffered sustained attacks over consecutive nights, attacks that killed over 1,000 civilians and destroyed much of the city. The raids targeted both the naval facilities that made Plymouth strategically important and the civilian areas where port workers lived. The attacks achieved significant destruction but did not prevent the port from functioning or create civilian pressure on the government to seek peace. Plymouth's experience, repeated in varying degrees across British cities, showed that urban populations could absorb punishment that peacetime experience suggested would be unbearable. The psychological warfare specialists in the German Foreign Ministry and Propaganda Ministry who analyzed British morale reports grew increasingly frustrated through the winter of 1940-41 as their predictions of imminent collapse proved wrong. The specialists had assumed that British morale was fragile because it rested on democratic politics that would force leaders to respond to civilian suffering. They had not accounted for the possibility that democratic politics might actually strengthen morale by giving civilians voice in their government and stake in defending it. The specialists' reports to Hitler grew more cautious about predicting when British morale would break, shifting from confident timelines measured in weeks to vaguer assessments that collapse might occur eventually if bombing continued long enough. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, faced particular difficulty explaining why British morale had not collapsed, as his ministry had predicted. Goebbels had assured Hitler that bombing would create political crisis in Britain, that Churchill's government would fall under pressure from civilians demanding peace, that British resolve would crack when confronted with German military superiority. The failure of these predictions undermined Goebbels' credibility with Hitler and forced the propaganda minister to develop new explanations for British endurance that did not acknowledge that German strategy had been based on wrong assumptions. Goebbels attributed British resistance to American manipulation, to Jewish influence over British politics, to Churchill's personal obstinacy, to anything except the genuine popular determination to resist Nazi Germany. Hitler's personal involvement in directing the bombing campaign revealed his frustration that British morale had not collapsed as planned. The Führer issued specific directives about which cities to target, which facilities to attack, how to maximize psychological impact. The directives reflected Hitler's conviction that British resistance rested on fragile morale that could be shattered through sufficient violence. The continued British defiance forced Hitler to confront the possibility that his understanding of British psychology was fundamentally wrong, that the population he had assumed would panic under bombing was instead enduring with determination that exceeded German capacity to break it through aerial assault. The intelligence reports that reached Hitler about British morale increasingly contradicted his assumptions. Agents reported that bombing was strengthening rather than weakening British resolve, that civilian casualties were creating anger at Germany rather than pressure on the British government, that the destruction was being absorbed without creating the political crisis that German strategy required. Hitler dismissed reports that contradicted his expectations, blamed intelligence officers for defeatism, insisted that continued bombing would eventually achieve the psychological collapse that had not yet occurred. The Wehrmacht generals who had conquered France watched the Battle of Britain and the Blitz with growing recognition that Hitler's strategy for defeating Britain was failing. The military victories that had been so complete on the continent could not be replicated against an island protected by the Channel and defended by a population whose morale seemed to strengthen rather than weaken under attack. The generals understood that without British capitulation, Germany faced the prospect of a prolonged war against an enemy that could not be quickly defeated, that might eventually be joined by other powers, that possessed industrial and imperial resources that time would mobilize against Germany. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, recorded in his diary the growing consensus among Wehrmacht leadership that Britain would not be invaded in 1940, that the window for invasion was closing as autumn turned to winter, that British morale had not collapsed despite months of bombing. Halder's entries documented frustration that strategic bombing, which was supposed to be a decisive weapon, had failed to produce the political effects that would make invasion unnecessary. The general's private writings suggested that he and other senior officers recognized that Hitler's assumptions about breaking British will had been proven wrong, but that the Führer would not acknowledge this failure. The decision to postpone Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely represented implicit acknowledgement that German strategy had failed to break British morale sufficiently to create conditions for successful invasion. The postponement was attributed to weather and to the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority. But underlying these technical explanations was the reality that British resistance had not weakened as Hitler had anticipated. The population that was supposed to be demoralized and demanding peace instead showed resolve that made invasion far more risky than German planning had assumed. The shift in German strategic focus toward the Soviet Union in late 1940 reflected Hitler's recognition that Britain would not be defeated quickly through bombing or invasion threat. The Führer concluded that Britain remained in the war only because of hope for eventual Soviet or American intervention, that eliminating the Soviet Union would remove Britain's last potential continental ally, that British morale would finally break when the last reason for hope disappeared. The logic was flawed. British morale rested on domestic factors more than on calculation about potential allies. But it guided German strategy away from continued focus on breaking British will through direct assault. The Blitz continued into 1941, but with declining intensity as Luftwaffe resources were redirected to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The reduced bombing demonstrated that German capability to sustain strategic air offensive was limited and that the campaign had not achieved its objectives. British cities had been bombed, civilians had been killed, property had been destroyed, but British morale had not collapsed. The government had not fallen, war production had continued, military resistance had been maintained, and the will to fight had survived the most intense bombing campaign that Germany could deliver. The British civilians who had endured the Blitz emerged with morale strengthened rather than weakened by the experience. The shared sacrifice had created bonds of solidarity. The successful endurance had generated confidence that further challenges could be met. The demonstration that bombing could be survived had removed fear of German capabilities that had existed before the campaign began. The population that Hitler had assumed would break under bombing instead took pride in having withstood the attacks, in having maintained routines and production despite German efforts, in having demonstrated that British society would not crack under pressure. The strategic implications of Hitler's failure to break British morale extended far beyond the immediate campaign. Britain's continued resistance meant that Germany faced enemies in both the West and the East, that German forces would be divided between fronts, that resources would be consumed in ways that might have been avoided if Britain had been knocked out of the war in 1940. The failure meant that British industry would continue producing weapons, that the Royal Navy would continue blockading Germany, that British airfields would eventually host American bombers that would devastate German cities in return for what the Luftwaffe had done to Britain. The morale that Hitler failed to break in 1940 sustained British resistance through subsequent crises. The losses in North Africa, the fall of Singapore, the Atlantic convoy battles, the defeats in Greece and Crete. The foundation of determination established during the Blitz carried through years when victory seemed distant and the war's outcome uncertain. The British population that had endured bombing without demanding capitulation would endure setbacks without losing faith that eventual victory was possible. The American observers who witnessed British morale during the Blitz reported to Washington that Britain would not collapse, that American aid would be used effectively, that British determination to resist justified support. The reports influenced American policy decisions about providing destroyers and supplies, about gradually increasing engagement with Britain's war effort, about recognizing that Britain represented a viable ally rather than a lost cause. Hitler's failure to break British morale thus had consequences for American policy that made eventual German defeat more likely. The propaganda value of British endurance during the Blitz extended to occupied territories where resistance movements drew inspiration from Britain's example. If Britain, bombed and isolated, could continue fighting, then occupied populations could maintain hope that liberation might eventually come. The British Broadcasting Corporation's broadcasts to occupied Europe included accounts of how British civilians were enduring German bombing, providing both information about British resistance and encouragement to populations living under German occupation. The psychological dimension of Hitler's failure became apparent in retrospect as historians analyzed how British morale had been sustained. Multiple factors contributed: effective leadership that articulated meaning in suffering, civil defense that gave civilians active roles in their own protection, information management that acknowledged difficulties while emphasizing resilience, social cohesion that created mutual support, and fundamental belief that the cause of resisting Nazi Germany was worth the costs being paid. Hitler's strategy had assumed that terror alone would overcome these factors, and that assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Luftwaffe's campaign against British cities demonstrated the limits of strategic bombing as a tool for breaking civilian morale. The bombing had killed tens of thousands of civilians, had destroyed vast amounts of property, had disrupted normal life in ways that created hardship and suffering. Yet it had not achieved its political objective of forcing British capitulation. The campaign revealed that morale in a democratic society with functioning institutions and effective leadership could withstand bombing that authoritarian regimes assumed would create collapse. The contrast between Hitler's assumptions about British morale and the reality of British endurance revealed fundamental misunderstandings that plagued German strategic thinking. Hitler assumed that democracies were weak, that civilian populations would demand peace rather than accept sacrifice, that material comfort mattered more than abstract principles. British resistance demonstrated that these assumptions were wrong, that democratic societies defending values they believed worth protecting could mobilize determination that exceeded what authoritarian leaders anticipated. The failure to break British morale in 1940 marked a turning point where German strategic assumptions were tested and found wanting. Hitler had planned for a short war that would be decided by rapid military victories that created political collapses in enemy governments. Britain's continued resistance, despite military setbacks, demonstrated that political will could survive military defeat if morale remained intact, that wars could not always be won quickly through superior tactics and operational skill, that Germany might face a prolonged conflict for which it was not prepared. The personal impact on Hitler of failing to break British morale appeared in his increasingly bitter denunciations of Churchill and of British resistance. The Führer had expected that Britain would recognize German superiority and would seek accommodation rather than endure bombing and isolation. British defiance represented rejection of Hitler's vision of German dominance and challenged his conviction that will alone could overcome material disadvantages. The failure to force British capitulation was one of Hitler's first major setbacks, and his response, blaming subordinates, dismissing accurate intelligence, insisting that continued effort would eventually succeed, established patterns that would recur through subsequent failures. The German public's understanding of why Britain had not been defeated involved propaganda that emphasized British stubbornness and American support rather than acknowledging that German strategy had failed. The regime could not admit that bombing had not broken British morale, because admission would raise questions about Luftwaffe capabilities and about Hitler's strategic judgment. The propaganda framed continued British resistance as irrational defiance sustained by American promises, rather than as rational decision by a population that believed continued fighting was preferable to surrender. The military lessons that Wehrmacht officers drew from the failure to break British morale were limited by institutional unwillingness to acknowledge that German strategic assumptions had been wrong. Some officers recognized that strategic bombing alone could not force capitulation, that invasion would have been necessary to defeat Britain, that the window for invasion had closed when morale had not collapsed as anticipated. Others insisted that the bombing campaign had been on the verge of success when it was terminated, that continued effort would have eventually broken British will, that the failure resulted from inadequate commitment rather than from flawed strategy. The historical judgment on Hitler's attempt to break British morale concluded that the campaign failed because it was based on incorrect assumptions about what sustained morale in democratic societies facing existential threats. Hitler assumed that terror would create collapse, that civilian casualties would generate pressure for peace, that isolation from allies would produce despair. Instead, terror created determination to resist, casualties generated anger at Germany, isolation fostered unity within British society. The Führer had fundamentally misunderstood British psychology and had paid for that misunderstanding by failing to achieve the quick victory that his strategic position required. The legacy of Hitler's failure to break British morale extended through the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. British confidence that society could withstand severe challenges was reinforced by the memory of having endured the Blitz. The narrative of British resilience became central to national identity and to understanding of the war years. The failure demonstrated that civilian morale could not be broken through terror alone, a lesson that influenced both British and German approaches to strategic bombing in subsequent years. The final assessment was that Hitler had failed to break British morale because he had not understood what sustained it. He had assumed that morale rested on material comfort and physical security, that destroying these would create political pressure for capitulation. British morale actually rested on belief that Nazi Germany represented a threat worth resisting, on confidence in leadership that articulated this belief effectively, on social cohesion that provided mutual support, on institutional resilience that allowed society to function despite bombing. Hitler's strategy addressed the wrong targets and employed the wrong methods, ensuring that British morale survived his best efforts to destroy it, and ensuring that Germany would face a prolonged war that his strategy was designed to avoid.